So it's my pleasure to welcome to the conference and to this keynote Sally Ann Ness. She is Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Riverside. Her research focuses on symbolic action in everyday life and in extraordinary ritual and secular performances. Sally has written on the semiotics of festival life, dance, and sport, all relevant to Dalcroze rhythmics. And one thing that's not written in your proceedings booklet is that she is also a CMA, a Certified Movement Analyst from the Laban Bartenieff Institute of Movement Studies. So really is a wonderful example of the interdisciplinarity that we are trying to focus on in this conference. She is an award-winning author, having published several books. Her article, Bali, the Camera and Dance, The Lost Legacy of the Mead-Bateson Collaboration, resonates with the Dalcroze history. Beryl de Zoet, an early graduate of the London School of Dalcroze Rhythmics and later a well-known dance critic, did much valuable research work in Bali with photographer Walter Spies. 70 years before Sally Ann's article, de Zoet and Spies published Dance and Drama in Bali. My thanks to Sandra Nash for bringing my attention to that. Sally's current research focuses on choreographic aspects of visitor practice in Yosemite National Park. And this is the topic of her keynote today. Please welcome Sally Ann Ness.
I just want to say thank you so much to John Habron for that very kind introduction, and to the scientific committee for the invitation to come and speak at this fantastic conference, and also to Angelica and to Eva for the hard work they've done to bring us all together. In addition to that, I just want to say a special thank you to Selma Odom, whose vision was the primary one that I think connected me to the interests of this group. So just delighted to be here today. Thank you, Selma. All right, so today I would like to present one part of a theory of cultural performance that I've been developing in research I've been conducting in Yosemite National Park in the United States. So, cultural performance, the term I'll be using today, is a phrase that came initially from the work of the 20th century American anthropologist Milton Singer. Singer defined cultural performances as, quote, public displays of symbols popularly understood to be emblematic of given ways of life. So you can see here how the term symbol is very central to this definition of performance, given kind of performance. Critically important to the definition, so I'm going to talk about that today, as John indicated. This is a very broad definition of cultural performance. It can include many kinds of performance phenomena. Certainly, many kinds of music and dance performance can fit into this definition. I imagine you can call to mind some as you're sitting there. So, however, can athletic performances of certain touristic kinds, which have been my focus in Yosemite. It's a bit light in here, but this is the best I can do to bring you to Yosemite. Perhaps you've seen this image. I know at least one person in here has. Perhaps you've stood and looked at this landscape. It's one of the most famous American landscapes, this particular view of Yosemite National Park. Around 4 million people visit this park each year, and they come from all over the world, probably from every country that's represented in this room, certainly from Austria and from many countries in Western Europe, which has had a formative role to play in creating the understanding and the interpretation of this landscape. It's located in the Western American coastal state of California on its eastern border. And it was first established as a park in 1863, which is just 2 years before the birthday that we're celebrating here. and that correspondence is not insignificant. I'll come back to that. Yosemite remains the crown jewel of the American National Park System. And that's the term that's very often used for it, even though America has no royalty. It's always described as the crown jewel landscape. And it's a very important part of what the American landscape writer Wallace Stegner once described as the geography of hope. So in this regard, Yosemite can be considered comparable in a perhaps vague, but still comparable to the kind of landscape that Gunhild Obersacher-Schuler described yesterday in relation to Jacques Dalcroze, in the way that he viewed the countryside outside of Vienna, and in the way that Rudolf Laban viewed Monte Verita and certain landscapes that were understood to be so inspiring for the kind of work that they were pursuing. Right? In the American context, Yosemite is the iconic landscape for identifying what could be the source of a better cultural future. So there is some connection there. I just want to bring that out. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about my philosophical orientation, which is not opposed to phenomenology, but also distinctly different in some ways. So I hope I have a chance to say more about that. The theory of cultural performance I'm developing is a pragmatic theory grounded in the philosophy of the turn-of-the-century American philosopher and scientist Charles Sanders Peirce, so a scientist. Peirce's philosophy is based, it's often called a process philosophy. He's called the process philosopher by some scholars. And the reason for that is that his ideas, his thinking is based in the recognition that in reality, and Peirce was a realist, in reality, time is always passing or moving. And that anything we may want to understand in reality is always going to have to be understood in process, or in movement. Right? So this is a very movement-friendly philosophical orientation, and I think of it as dancerly in this regard, given my Laban training. You may think of it as musical as well, and I believe that both are equally apt for the purposes of cultural performance theory. So it's not a zero-sum game here. Right? You may find as I go through Peirce's theory that his process philosophy has much in common with the theories and methods and philosophy of Émile Jacques Dalcroze. I do not think this is accidental, but the explanation for it has to remain the topic of another lecture. I will say today, however, I can at least point to one correspondence that occurs through Peirce's wife, Juliette Peirce, who was European by birth and raised in Europe. However, after she moved to the United States, she studied acting in the mid-1880s, and she studied with an American named James Steele Mackay, who was one of Francois Delsarte's final students. Mackay worked with Delsarte in Paris in 1869, and he brought Delsarte's method. He was not the only one, but he was probably the most renowned teacher of the Delsarte method in the United States. And his work had a broad and enduring influence on the art of theater in the United States, which has been documented by a number of scholars, Nancy Reuter most prominently. And Delsarte's work also deeply influenced both Juliette, who was an aspiring actress, and Charles. Charles Peirce himself studied elocution with Mackay, so he embodied the Delsarte method. So in this regard, Delsarte is something of a common philosophical ancestor for both Peirce and Jacques Dalcroze, and we may perhaps attribute some, though I do not think all, of the more remarkable correspondences in their thinking to that shared intellectual and artistic figure. So in any case, the theory of cultural performance that I'm developing using Peirce's work is a semiotic theory as well. It's a theory formulated in terms of symbols, go back to that definition of cultural performance, and how symbols come to mean what they do. Peirce's entire philosophy is sometimes referred to as a semiotic, and the extra E here, if for those of you who may be familiar with this word spelled differently without that E in the middle, the extra E here is used specifically to refer to Peirce's approach to the study of symbols. Right? It actually is not corresponding to Delsarte's semiotic, which also sometimes is spelled this way. Peirce was dealing with semiotic theory several decades before he was exposed to the work of Delsarte. Right? So I argue that Peirce's semiotic, with this extra E, is basically a choreographic semiotic, meaning to say that it is not oriented by linguistic symbolism or by textual symbolism of any kind, but rather by forms of symbolism that occur in the performing arts more generally, and which are perhaps most prominently illuminated in the nonverbal aspects of dance and music. So a case here could be made for both art forms. Peirce's semiotic, I argue, contrasts in some basic respects with semiotic theories developed in or derived from the work of such scholars as Ferdinand de Saussure, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Judith Butler, who are all, by the way, the great opponents of phenomenology. Michel Foucault in particular, his life's work was devoted to forming a critique of phenomenology. And so Peirce's work is not opposed to theirs, I argue. It does not contradict them. However, it does differ from them all in that all of these theories share one very basic common assumption about the character of all symbols, including those that constitute the cultural performances that we analyze and interpret. For my purposes today, I term this assumption a representationalist assumption, an assumption about symbols in general. And this is an assumption that is not shared by pragmatic semiotic theory, nor is it evident in the work of Jacques Dalcroze, at least I would argue. Right? So my main focus today is going to be on explaining this difference. It's a difference that I argue makes a critical difference for performance theory. Okay. All right. So pragmatic semiotics has been helpful to me in my efforts to understand how visitors to Yosemite National Park have found ways to publicly develop, going back to this definition, to publicly develop meaningful connections to the landscape and to define and display themselves as emblematic of its given ways of life. So the symbols on display in Yosemite are human beings that have turned themselves into cultural signs or subjects. Cultural subject formation and the public performance of cultural subjectivity are two main foci of my research in Yosemite. And I think of subject here very much as Jacques Dalcroze did, at least as I understand it. Right? As that term, and my understanding of it is very new, so my understanding of that term comes in large part from the presentation of Lisa Parker yesterday at this conference, when we were learning about a certain given subject that Dalcroze had identified as one of importance. I define visitors as performers of cultural subjects very similarly. Right? And as cultural performers, Yosemite's visitors are meaning makers. In the words, I'm using here a phrase that is associated in anthropological discourse with the work of the cultural anthropologist Sherry Ortner, who studied, among other things, mountain climbers on Mount Everest. Right? And her definition of a meaning maker is, quote, a real historical actor who engages in processes of, quote, rendering symbolic phenomena. Right? Or as I view it, actors who render phenomena, living human phenomena, symbolic. Right? So here you see rock climbing visitors as real historical actors displaying and rendering themselves in a very public way into symbols of the landscape, or symbols with the landscape, right? So the parallel here would be to the musician who in the act of performing renders her or himself into a symbol of the musical landscape, or the thought world, or the musical score, or the subject that inspires their performance. Right? So in Lisa Parker's workshop, we were rendering ourselves into symbols of syncopation, right? And becoming cultural subjects of the calypso tradition. Right? Was anybody here at that workshop? Right. So good. So many of you were. Do you remember the rhythm that we did? Can we do it really fast so everybody's included in that? Lisa, can you help us? Dun 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 dun. Every time I remember Lisa. Thank you. Come back, girl. Water comes to my mind. Come back, my girl. Come back, girl. Water comes to my mind. There you go. Thank you. All right. So that's the embodiment. Thank you for helping me do that, because it's important that I become the subject, so I can speak about that now. Right? So that's the idea of becoming a cultural subject. So you see how close the connections are to the Dalcroze method, right? So rock climbers in Yosemite, or any other visitors in Yosemite, they are perhaps somewhat more radically improvisational. Perhaps they are score creators rather than score representers, although this is, I would argue, much less true than you might realize. Perhaps they take more liberty. As Hilda Kappas was saying yesterday evening, they take more liberty to work with instruments that are not instruments. But nonetheless, in their movements in the landscape, they are rendering cultural symbols and cultural subjects, and they themselves are becoming symbols of America's geography of hope. Right? So that's their subject, if you will. Right? So with that kind of overview, let me move on now to a bit more detailed explanation of what I mean by symbol, using Peirce's theoretical terms, so that a lot is hanging on that idea. Right? So a symbol for Peirce. Right? From Peirce's perspective, a symbol is first and foremost one general type of Peircean sign. Right? The sign concept is the most basic, all-inclusive theoretical foundation of the whole of Peirce's pragmatic semiotic. So everything I, as an anthropologist, want to argue about cultural performance, musical and otherwise, touristic and otherwise, what performance can mean, how it can happen, what its consequences are, how it relates to language, thought, art, society, politics, economics, reality, all of it hangs on this definition. And what makes this complicated is that Peirce gave many definitions of the sign at different stages of his work. And some scholars argue that there are no significant differences between these definitions. However, I am one that argues there are very significant differences. Right? And the definition that I'm using is a definition that Peirce wrote in relation to what he called the rhetorical branch of his semiotic, a definition that he moved toward in the later years of his life, and which he came increasingly to emphasize as a more apt definition of his semiotic in general. It is a definition, interestingly, that he developed after his exposure to Delsarte's work. So the term rhetorical characterizes, as I said, the term rhetorical characterizes one of Peirce's three main branches of semiotic. And as he envisioned it, it's the inquiry, it's the branch that seeks to understand how one sign gives birth to another and especially how one thought brings forth another. Rhetorical analyses focus directly on the persuasiveness of signs in generating new meanings. They focus on ingenuity and innovativeness, as well as on a sign's ability to give pleasure or some other comparable quality of feeling. The rhetorical analyses are as much concerned with the emergence of a sign's identity as with processes of communication between conventional, fully formed subjects. Rhetorical inquiry is also prone to work toward the discovery of previously unknown kinds of sign performance, rather than marking the limits of meaning-making inherent in given grammars or established logics, which is probably the greatest difference between the Peircean rhetorical semiotic and the French structuralist and post-structuralist schools of semiotic theory. Right? It is a distinction, this is the key distinction between that approach and Peirce's. So in all of these ways, rhetorical inquiry deals with signs as living, vital, animate, and developing processes. This is the key distinction, in my view, between rhetorical definitions and definitions forthcoming from other branches of Peirce's semiotic. It's a distinction that foregrounds how signs enable learning, right? And how signs generate new ways of understanding. The rhetorical definition that I have formulated for my work is based on two definitions given in the later Peirce. These were formulated in 1903 and in 1906, respectively. So note the correspondence to Jacques Dalcroze's life and work, 1903 and 1906. We were just learning yesterday about the concert that occurred here in Vienna at the Musikverein by Dalcroze in 1906. So very close synchrony in the emergence of these ideas, right? And my definition is working with these two definitions. Also, it's I want to give credit to the work done by Peirce scholar Vincent Colapietro, who formulated a definition I have been very much influenced by in recent work he's done on the rhetorical branch of Peirce's semiotic. Okay. So let me go through these very quickly. The first 1903 definition is a definition phrased in the terms of Peirce's three universal categories of experience, which is where his work is most obviously aligned with phenomenological inquiry. The categories of experience are dealing with, Peirce called it a phaneron, but he meant to make a very close link there to Kant's phenomenology. Right? Also, you may note that for those of you who are interested in Delsarte's work, the triadic character of Peirce's semiotic. This is another remarkable correspondence between the work of Peirce and the work of Delsarte, although Peirce was developing these categories decades in advance of his exposure to the Delsarte methods. Okay. This definition is what is called a mature definition of the Peircean sign. In this definition, Peirce characterizes signs as facts of thirdness. Thirdness here can be understood as the quality of continuity, the quality manifest in processes that make connections of intelligence happen. It's very close, thirdness, very close, I would argue, to what Jacques Dalcroze understood as rhythm. The second, even later definition, the 1906 definition, was given in a letter Peirce wrote on March 9th of that year to Lady Victoria Welby of England, who is another influential figure who may have served to connect Peirce to the work of Delsarte or even to the work of Jacques Dalcroze, possibly. In this formulation, Peirce defines a sign as, quote, any medium for the communication or extension of a form or feature. To appreciate the rhetorical character of this definition must be remembered that form, as it is used here, is always apparent to the later Peirce as a living form, a form in the making. So this animate formingness is what I term movement in my definition, following the definition of Peirce scholar Vince Colapietro. Form in logic becomes movement in rhetoric. This is one key shift of perspective that occurs between the branches of Peirce's semiotic. Colapietro's shorthand for this rhetorical definition of the sign reads as a moved and moving mover. All signs for purse, rhetorically conceived, are moving signs. Movement is the most basic character of significant phenomena. These definitions have informed my own definition of the Persian sign, which reads as an agent, and I thank you, Maria Elena, for giving us such an excellent and clear definition of agency in your talk, as an agent of intelligent or at least intelligible relational movement. The definition of the sign I employ in this way identifies from a rhetorical perspective the four fundamental distinctive features Peirce attributed to all signs in his later work, including the signs of mathematics, the signs of language, all signs. Right? Relationality, triadic relationality, agency, intelligence, and movingness or vitality. What all these definitions point to is that from a rhetorical regard, a Peircean sign is at base kinetic rather than substantial. A sign is always moving in a certain way. Its agentive, performative character is born in movement, not in content. It emerges in activity, in transition, transformation, transmission, or translation, or in some other kind of changeful process. A semiotic sign, in performance, moves movingly as it, in its turn, has been so moved. This triple movingness is the source of its performative identity, as well as its meaningfulness, its intelligence, and its memorability. The sign's thoughtful movingness enables all of its relational capabilities. All other semiotic identities, educational, intellectual, substantive, argumentative, contemplative, representational, even conceptual and textual, all of them emerge out of this relatively basic movement-based character. In other words, a sign, any sign, including any symbol, is significant in that the movements it inspires make relationships happen, and these relations forge or sustain connections that matter in some way and enable further learning. So going back to Yosemite National Park, a rocky ledge can perform as a sign when it enables a precariously balanced climber to realize, and I'm using the term exactly the way Jacques Dalcroze used the term, to realize a more secure position in relation to a rock wall. The ledge becomes vitally meaningful or significant if this realization enables the climber to avoid taking an injurious fall down a treacherous granite face. Any trail, path, road, or route, in its capacity to move travelers into new relationships within an environment they seek to explore, performs as a semiotic sign. As these two examples, I hope, begin to make clear, the rhetorical conceptualization of the Peircean sign characterizes a sign's most fundamental signifying agency as being one of mediation rather than representation. This is perhaps the most important conceptual shift for the study of cultural performance. In his later work, Peirce determined that the concept of representation was itself too narrow to characterize all of the many ways that a sign, as he conceived of it, could operate and perform as such. He wrote, "I did not then," and he's referring to work he was producing in 1867, again before Mackay, "I did not then know enough about language to see that to attempt to make the word representation serve for an idea so much more general than any it habitually carried was injudicious. The word mediation would be better." Mediation, as Colapietro observes, is deeper than interpretation, just as semiosis, the full range of sign performance, is wider than representation. The concept of mediation is what reinforces the character of the pragmatic sign as choreographic. Signs do not have to represent to make intelligible sense or generate symbolic meaning. They can move informingly and performatively in other ways as well, which is what the research that Maria Elena was just documenting is proving. Right? Once the sign spectrum is so enlarged, it gains the capacity to define as symbolic, moving relationships whose influence on conventional cultural performances and their established symbolic discourses would otherwise go unrecognized. This is a criticism of the semiotic schools that argue that language determines the way we think, right? Put very bluntly. This allows us instead to consider something virtually inconceivable from alternative semiotic perspectives on meaning making. Non-representational signs or non-conventional symbols. This mediational perspective links intelligently. Oh, I'm so sorry you can't see this slide at all. You really can't. But the background is the main waterfall, the Yosemite Falls. And in the foreground on your left-hand side is a figure that's a human figure there relating to the landscape, right? So this mediational perspective links the movements of living to those of acting, to those of learning, in a manner that's very similar to the Dalcroze perspective. Mediation is the theoretical bridge or bridging, connecting conventional cultural symbolism to ecological forms of living. The Tuolumne River in Yosemite National Park, for example, as it may move bodies, human and non-human alike, into vital relationships with one another once they are caught up in its flows, can achieve significance as a mediating non-representational sign as well. Again, a sign of living, a sign of acting, a sign of learning. Okay. And the Yosemite Valley landscape in general, in its capacity to attract people from all over the world and to move them along with all of the landscapes and places to which they are themselves related into new relationships with itself and with one another, performs on a monumental scale as a mediating, non-representational sign. It creates subjects that visitors learn to inhabit and to perform movingly. All right, so to conclude, it is, of course, the Calypso thing took a little more time than I thought, so sorry. I'm working fast here. It is, of course, by no means my intention to discount, let alone deny, the ways in which representational signs and representationally determined forms of meaning-making influence and shape visitor experiences in Yosemite. It is nonetheless my objective to argue that these kinds of sign performances are not the whole story of the cultural performance that occurs in this landscape, just as they are not the whole story of musical performance, right? Or dance performance. Right? Much of what transpires in Yosemite visitor performance is non-representationally significant and thoughtful. Much of what visitors do is mediational as opposed to representational in motivation and in interpretation. The meaning visitors make and the selves they cultivate, the lessons that they learn, the subjects that they study, have as much, if not more, to do with the relating of presences as it does with the communication of always already represented information. What athletic performances in the landscape I've been studying can be all about is mediating self-world relationships. It is about bringing alivenesses born in novel life forms in the making into new kinds of intelligent connection. It is as much about this as it is about projecting conventionally defined knowledge and its symbolic discourses onto present experience. As we begin to think mediationally, as well as representationally, we begin to see all that performing visiting can come to mean in Yosemite, and how people find themselves anew and transform themselves, as well as to recreate their subjecthood, cultural and otherwise, as they move in relation to the landscape. That's it. Thank you.